Hi everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today. So next best thing is I am going to record the second session, or actually starting with the end of the first session as an alternative, and then hopefully we pick it back up live next week. So probably many of you remember, if you were there last week, that we were going through the time period from mannerism all the way up until we get to basically the development of the Royal Academies to the art, first in France and then later in England, where we paused starting to look at this artist's work, Angelica Kauffman. And this, of course, is her self-portrait. I'll just remind you that Angelica Kauffman came from a very humanistic upbringing during the Enlightenment. She was trained very, very rigorously in Rome and had an international kind of reputation before she even ended up in London with the British Royal Academy of the Arts. She was Swiss-born, by the way. She is coming into art, of course, during the time period in which classical aesthetics are the most predominant set of kind of artistic criteria by which artists need to be trained, and of course they will be judged in the big academic exhibitions that happen every couple of years or so. And as I said before, this creates a number of difficulties for women. This is a work that is her picture on the ceiling of the Royal Academy of the Arts in London, of someone learning how to become an artist, basically. And you'll recall that I've made a big point of saying, women artists, especially in the classical tradition, who are expected to master the anatomy of the human body, are really at a disadvantage, because as you can see here, what we see a woman doing is copying from a plaster cast, but they weren't allowed, and I'm sure some of them figured out ways around this, but in public, they, at least, and in their training, they weren't allowed to study from the nude, male nude. Most of them weren't even allowed to study from the female nude either, which again, if this is fundamental to your artistic practice, to really know anatomy inside and out, is going to create a lot of disadvantages for you. In Rome, as I mentioned at the end of our last meeting, she was surrounded by some pretty interesting, very important intellectual figures, Otto Mang, and here you see Johann Winckelmann, her portrait of one of the earliest art historians, and someone who spent his entire life, as those early scholars did, really knowing the ins and outs of classical arts, which, you can imagine in conversation and in tutelage, he would have shared with Angelica Kauffman, which is, a short way of saying she was really in the know. More than most of the male artists that I'm aware of, she really paid attention and was surrounded by people who understood classical arts in depth. So then, being a very, very smart woman, she realized that if you're going to be an artist in the classical tradition, there are some third rails, so to speak, to watch out for. Remember last time I said that one of the things that really plagued women artists was the expectations of both subject matter that was appropriate, meaning various stories. If you were, for instance, a woman artist and you wanted to try your hand at a very important historical battle scene, you would get beaten up by critics who would say, first, women don't know anything about violence. They don't know anything about history. They're the fairer, weaker sex. They couldn't possibly know anything about this. Therefore, they shouldn't be painting it. Or, because those battle scenes are filled with so much anatomy, they might go at you at the level of skill and just say, obviously, this woman doesn't know how to paint a male figure. They should not do such things. She knows this. She's obviously grown up amidst it. She will do a few scenes that get her into those territories, but for the most part, she steers her career towards subjects that would have been deemed appropriate for women, including this one. This is a famous one known as Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures, also known as Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi. She was Gaius Gracchus's one of her children, who's a great reformer. The subject is particularly appropriate, I want to say, to women, because basically what it's telling you about is how to be a great, upstanding, moral, and ethical mother. The story goes this way. Cornelia, who is in the center of this picture, has been invited over to her friend's house. And her friend to the right here is pulling various forms of jewelry out of a jewelry box and showing them to Cornelia and saying, look at all these beautiful things I have. Where are your treasures? And Cornelia, of course, appropriately, as is esteemed from women, points to her children as her treasures, saying, like, material things don't matter. The thing that really matters is that as a good mother, I raise great men who can go on to do great things. And again, this kind of leans right into the expectations for women at the time. One of the most esteemed roles historically in the West and beyond for women has always been the kind of woman behind the man, especially the mother. So you can see how she does that. There's just a couple of other things I want to point out about this, and I won't belabor this, but she's very, very studied in classical arts, and so one of the things that you find in a lot of classical arts, of course, are classical subjects. For instance, this story from ancient Rome, and then, of course, standard ways of setting up compositionally your subject. So if you follow my cursor, we have a big pyramidal form here. That kind of triangular form that classical artists use so often is something that instills a lot of stability to a work. And then, of course, you can see the figures themselves. If I get you in a little closer on these two women, this nose that basically barely has an indentation from the forehead to the nose is typical of Greek sculptures of the classical age, and is adopted by a number of painters, both male and female, to make a nod back to classical times. Now, there are many other things in here as well, but that gives you the kind of basics of it. It's also, of course, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer to Victorian times, and there is something that happens in a lot of women's art that that really picks up the subject of the lamenting woman as their preeminent subject. So, for instance, and this is just kind of all the rage at the time, the brooding, sad, lamentable woman is part of a lot of literature. It's showing up in a lot of kind of popular forms as well, and the artists are taking their key here too. So this is, of course, Penelope at her loom, long-suffering Penelope, who was, again, it's a Greek classical subject, the wife of Odysseus, who, according to the tales, basically is trying to hold off suitors in wait for her husband Odysseus, who everyone else thinks has perished at sea, but she is going to remain faithful, right? Very important moral norm for women of the time as well. And you see that dog sitting down there. Dogs are symbols of fidelity. Just remember Fido and the idea of how loyal your dog is to you. Well, what she does to hold off these suitors is that she promises that she'll make a decision on which person she picks, and there are many of them, as soon as she gets done weaving this kind of mourning shawl. But every night after she weaves during the day, she pulls out everything that she's weaved, and she's able to kind of hold them off for years and years and years. Again, one after another of these kind of women in distress of the time. Again, this is a very, very smart artist who realizes the subjects that are expected from her as a woman and plays into them as well as she can do. This is, for instance, this is actually Ariadne being abandoned by Theseus. Ariadne, again, this is a story that shows up frequently in both in male and women's art, but in man's art, Ariadne, who is the brains behind the Theseus and the Minotaur operation, she's the one who, as Theseus she's the daughter of King Midas, and on his way into the labyrinth to defeat the Minotaur, she's the one who says, listen, you're going into a labyrinth, you're going to need a thread to navigate your way in and out. and hands him the spool of thread. They have a brief romance, and then on the island of Naxos, before he sails home, he abandons her. Later on, she is basically greeted by Bacchus, who takes her into the underworld, and they become husband and wife for a brief time. So there is some kind of golden lining, I assume. But here you see her, oh no, he's left, and Cupid, love, the symbol of love, is wringing his eyes. He can't believe that this has occurred. The way that a male artist would have represented this, and there are a million examples, would have been her nude on a grass lying in a field. So we have something slightly different, kind of her emotional response to the scene, but still a subject very much in line with what women were expected to paint. Or, for instance, this is, again, a woman, now one that's being admired. It's actually Hector, who is the son of Troy, kind of seeing Helen for the first time, or in this case, Hector stealing off to Troy with Helen. I think everyone knows this story, but if you don't, this is the start of the Trojan War, of course. What happens is that up on Mount Olympus, there's a big wedding, and at the wedding, the goddess of strife isn't invited, and so she goes off to the Garden of the Hesperides, and she picks an apple and inscribes on it, "To the most beautiful," and she rolls it in on the table, and all the goddesses erupt in argument about who is the most beautiful of them. It ends up coming down to the big three. It's Athena or Hera or Aphrodite, and they go to Zeus and say, who is the most beautiful? Zeus, for all his failings, is smart enough to realize this is a no-win situation. He's going to make two enemies, and one of those might be his wife, Hera, who he's married to. So he passes this on to the young prince of Troy, Paris. And Paris, of course, doesn't know what to do. He's greeted by these three beautiful goddesses, and of course agrees to judge who is the most beautiful. When he can't decide based upon their physical appearance, they all start bribing him. And the one who wins those bribes is Aphrodite, who tells him the most beautiful woman in the world, anyone he wants, will fall in love with him, and conjures up an image of this demigoddess Helen, who unfortunately is already married in Greece to Menelaus. But he goes and he seduces her with the help of Cupid and Aphrodite and takes her back to Troy, thus launching all the Greeks to win her back. And here you have a work that, again, is all about kind of women placed in minor peril, but really it's about beauty and, a good mythological story. My favorite of all of these, and I hope you like it as well, is this one. This is a work that's called Zeuxis Selecting His Models for Helen of Troy. So we've just seen Helen, the most beautiful woman, face that launched 1,000 ships and all of that. And Zeuxis, for those of you who don't know, is a Greek painter who we know through the historical record because some of the Romans talked about him in his work and famous contests he had with other painters. So we know he existed. We're not exactly sure what his work looked like because no Greek paintings remain to us. But you can imagine, he would have painted a scene of Helen of Troy, and how would he have come up with the most beautiful woman? Well, again, based upon ideas that have been around since the Renaissance, what you would do is you would go basically take kind of sketches based upon different women and create a composite from them. Taking the most beautiful arm from one woman, the most beautiful cheekbones from another, most beautiful lips from another, and putting them together to form kind of this idealized, beautiful woman. So here's Zeuxis doing that, and you can tell he's really caught up in his activity. Here he is, follow my cursor. And, it's kind of like a total male fantasy, right? Makes being an artist look pretty great. There's calipers down here on the ground, which would have been a more kind of mechanical and hands-off way to select beauty, but, he's dropped those and he's touching them and looking at them and so forth. Well, while he's doing this and having that male fantasy, over here on the right-hand side, and this is fairly common in her works, is a self-portrait of Angelica Kauffman, who one presumes, under the auspices of being one of these great beauties, has sneaked into his studio, but while he's otherwise occupied, she is stealing his paints and paintbrushes, which I just think is a great little joke about men being caught up in beauty while women, figure out a way to maneuver them. Again, just briefly, I don't want to belabor the point, but lots and lots of scenes of mythological subjects. Hector taking his leave of Andromache here, or scenes, again, over and over again of, we forget this, but a lot of scenes that are based upon their portraits, right? This is the way that artists get paid. So this is the Baroness Juliana von Krudener and her son, Lady Elizabeth Foster here. Another lady of the court, family of Ferdinand IV, the King of Naples. I think that's the wife of Ferdinand. And basically one after another of family portraits. I wanted to end with this one, though, just to kind of bring us back to this question of some of the difficulties that women artists faced, and this makes it, I hope, a little bit more complex for everyone. I mean, it's pretty easy to get if it's tough to get into the schools, if when you get into schools you're not given the same training, if when you're given the same training you're not allowed to do the same subjects, and if you are, you're judged really harshly about those subjects. That all makes a certain amount of sense. And I should just kind of add into this a little quote so that you see how real this is. When Angelica Kauffman was criticized for her representation of the genders, here's what someone said in a public commentary, by the way, as a kind of ode to the royal painters. Angelica my plaudits gains, her art so sweetly canvas stains. Her dames so gracious give me such delight, but were she married to such gentle males as figured in her painted tales, I fear she'd find a stupid wedding night. Right? How petty can you get? And what they're saying is, she's damned if she does. If she tries to paint a hyper-masculized male, they'll say you don't understand anatomy, and if she paints, a kind of emotional male, well, that's not what real men are, and so forth. But the place that I was going with is, this is the work that is called The Artist in the Character of Design, Listening to the Inspiration of Poetry. And it's based upon a biographical component of her career in which she was apparently quite the literary figure too, and a great poetess, and was, at one point kind of hovering between these two, and then she launched directly into artistry, but took inspiration from lyric poetry. And so you see in her hand, some kind of writing implement. It looks like a stylus or a silver point. She's got her basically kind of sketchbook open. This, by the way, is the starting point of any great art in the classical tradition. It comes from what the Italians call disegno, or line, kind of plotting out component of art. And then off to the side, you see a female figure with her arm wrapped around her, holding in her hand a lyre, giving her inspiration. Now, inspiration or muses is where I'm going with this. Typically, if a male artist were going to represent this, he would represent a beautiful young woman, oftentimes without any clothes on, by the way, symbolic of inspiration for him. Now, there were muses of all kinds of things in Greek times, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say, well, although we know it is, to say, as a woman, maybe what you would do as an inversion of that is just have a super hot young man be your inspiration and put them in the picture alongside you, but we know the social norms of the time wouldn't have allowed that. So she picks a beautiful woman, has her, chastely clothed, but this arm over the shoulder and the kind of leaning in makes you think like, oh, there are all these tropes about artistry and inspiration that were really designed presuming that the artist would be male. And when you try to apply them to the female artist, they get, well, they're not quite the same, is the best way to put it. Now, there is no indication at the time that this plagued her, but I can't tell you the number of times that I have assigned something having to do with Angelica Kauffman on a test. One of my students, not paying a lot of attention, will throw in there that she was presumed to be a lesbian, and I assume it's based upon this scene. Two women too close together, the idea of inspiration always has this sexual charge. What do you do if you're a woman artist? No, she was married a couple of times, and she had a very, very steamy affair with Jean-Paul Marat during the French Revolution before he was assassinated. So to move on from this, if you're following along, we've just finished up lecture guide number 1, and we're moving on to lecture guide number 2, and moving into kind of a little bit later time period. Just to give you a sense of something else that's going on in the background of this whole story I'm telling, it was completely appropriate for women to take art classes. These are basically women artists, or not artists, they're women who are taking classes at the National Gallery to the Arts, training, learning how to paint. We know that as long as a woman was just cultivating herself, right, adding a little culture, that was good. As long as you were an amateur artist, that was good. It's when women, and this is something that plagues women historically right up to the present moment, it's when women step into the realm of actual kind of business practices or real professionalism that there's all these walls thrown up to them. So here it's completely appropriate for a woman to kind of culture herself. But when they move from that culture to, let's say, real artistry, they tend to get in trouble. I'm just going to show you one work by Anne Seymour Dahmer, an artist who came from an upper middle class family, trained in sculpture, even went to Rome for a while to work on sculpture, and actually carved her works herself. This is her portrait of the Countess of Derby from the late 1780s, maybe even 1790s. She did a lot of different sculptures. They tend to be, some of them, still in the public realm, but most of them are kind of missing. We don't know what happened to a lot of them. But what we do know is that when she tried her hand at male nudes, she got beaten up for it. So this is a famous kind of satirical illustration that was published in a British newspaper called the Damarian Apollo. And what you see is a kind of a middle-class woman carving a statue of a male figure here, but he's playing with the idea of the salaciousness of, obviously we've got this spear that's going out the front, very, very phallic, and she's, of course, carving his butt here. And it's, it's just one of those things you would never imagine a male artist having to suffer, poking fun at her inability, supposedly, or inappropriateness of carving nudes. What was accepted, of course, were, amateur artists who maybe slowly worked their way up the ladder so that, and by the way, amateur artist just means someone who didn't have to rely for a living on their art and didn't presume to. Like they had some money elsewhere or family that took care of them, and they did some paintings, maybe even have exhibited some works in the salon, but really, really didn't try to say, hey, I'm a great artist, pay attention to me. And an example of that is Emily Mary Osborne here, Nameless and Friendless, who again took some training, worked as an amateur artist for a long time, and then near to the end of her career, after winning awards multiple times in kind of lower genre subjects, kind of proclaimed herself a professional artist, and that's where everything went wrong for her. But this work that she wins some awards for and it gets turned into an engraving and published is very typical for her work. What we have here is a recent widow, which is represented by what she's got over her shoulder, over her finger, a kind of string that is a mourning string, and she's wearing black, of course. And what she's doing is she's basically going to an art dealer, and one presumes trying to get him to buy some of her work so that she can pay for her life, to stay afloat now that she doesn't have anyone to take care of her. Now, there's so many presumptions here, many of which are true, of course, but others which are just standard, that, once a woman loses her husband, she's got no way to take care of herself. Here she is, nameless and friendless. She turns her stuff over. She looks morose. Maybe her son, or maybe someone helping her out, is the only one looking intently at the dealer as he assesses. One wonders, how to rip her off here. And then off to the other side, these two figures, who are basically kind of cads, who are looking at a picture of a dancer, by the way, in their hands, are surmising whether they can move in for the kill, right? They're dandies. They're someone who is there to, seduce her, or whatever you would call this. And so she's caught in this impossible situation. And these are, again, the types of subjects, women in peril, that really played at the time. They're starting to play even more as Victorian culture really adopts this standard of women are most attractive when they are in a state of distress. Now, when a work of art is, gets popular enough, what ends up happening is that the artist basically leases a limited option to someone to turn it into, in this case, an engraving that is then created, and you can have multiple copies of it, and that's what you see here. Again, women in states of distress doing things, in this case, that are part of the professional career of women. This is Anna Elizabeth Blunden's work called The Seamstress. Some of you will remember this work when I did the one-off lecture. I juxtaposed this with Kate Kollwitz's work, who's coming up at the end of today's lecture. Very, very typical for this artist, types of works. It's a seamstress. Seamstress, by the way, some women worked in larger kind of factories together, but being a seamstress was one of the few things that unwed women could continue to do that was seen as very feminine and a way to make at least enough money to keep yourself afloat. What we have here is a seamstress who, dawn is approaching. She's not done with her work, and she's praying, that someone will give her the strength to just get through this. So think of what we have kind of piled up here in terms of expectations of gender. A woman who is a seamstress, who is unwed, who is in a state of distress, who very rightly so in a Christian society is, calling out to God because she's a good Christian to help her out. This work was created in 1854. In 1843, Thomas Hood published a very famous poem called The Song of the Shirt, from which this is obviously a kind of illustration. In that poem, he talks about a woman in this same state, hearing the bells ring and knowing the hour is fast approaching. She calls out to God to help her out, and miraculously she's able to finish this up, and I suppose go on to the next problem that confronts her. By the way, just so you can see this, I also teach the history of photography at the University of Washington, so I wanted to show you some early daguerreotypes of seamstresses from right around the same time period. Right? These are, a daguerreotype is something that if you had, let's say, lower middle class money, you could certainly afford. And you'll notice that, both of these women very proudly embrace the fact that their profession is a part of their personal identity. Very briefly, because there's not a ton of work extant from her and we don't know a ton about her, but I can't pass her up, the American artist Edmonia Lewis, who was of mixed race. We don't, again, know a ton about her biography. But what we do know is that she came from a mixed race mother who was part black and part indigenous, and her father was likely black as well. She grew up, her parents died, her dad doesn't seem to have been around much, but her mom died when she was 9 years old, and she went to live with her aunts, who were indigenous people, and yet very well educated. And then her brother made a mint in the gold rush and helped put her through college. She gravitated towards the arts, in particular sculpture, ended up going to Oberlin and then off to Rome to study sculpture because there were no sculpture schools in the United States, and produced as one of her most famous sculptures, again, which she carved herself. It's a little less than life size, this work called Forever Free. So she's really training during the time of the Civil War. And here you have an African American woman and her husband, one presumes, who have been emancipated and are, of course, very, very happy about this. And, you know, as a mixed-race woman, she is really focusing on the things that matter to, in this case, African Americans of the time. Here's just a close-up of this. You know, no one's ever going to say that Edmonia Lewis's skill is something like, you know, Michelangelo or what have you, but it is an incredible skill. This is all a one piece of marble, and all this intercarving and interlacing of bodies is a difficult thing to do. Now, she doesn't have the same understanding or, frankly, just training to capture anatomy in an incredible detail, but, you know, it's pretty impressive nonetheless. Wanted to, again, going to the other side of things, show you this work here that is the old Indian maker or arrow maker and his wife. So focusing again on the representation of indigenous people and showing them, frankly, as human beings in their own right. There is some degree of what was very common at the time, which is to really focus only on the things that are indigenous, not show any Western clothing or what have you. That was just kind of standard for the day. But if you were to go look at some of the white artists representing indigenous people or Native Americans at the time, you would see some pretty standard cliches. In particular, Native Americans doing horrible things to white people so that we could demonize them. And, you know, we're right when this is created. Let's see, what is the date on this? About 1872 or so. We're right in the heart of the Indian Wars, you know, in which we're ever increasingly either pushing Native Americans onto reservations or getting into huge, war conflicts with them. Now, I'm going to head back into France here. You're going to see a little blip as I just briefly take a break to get a drink of water, but I will be right back, and you'll notice very little of this whole thing. So, back in France, middle of the 19th century, Royal Academy, as we talked about last time, is the biggest game in town. Classical aesthetics is the biggest game in town. But we were starting to see some new movements afoot that are putting some pressure. And by the end of the century, of course, the classical tradition will be something that's seen as quite passé by most contemporary artists of the time. But if you were to go to one of the academic salon anytime from, let's say, 1840s or so to the 1890s, what you're going to see a lot of are female nudes. Female nudes everywhere. They became incredibly popular based upon the long tradition of the nude in Western classical art, and also with an explosion of the bourgeois class who are buying tons of paintings. And, you know, let's face it, if a bourgeois male who's got enough money can throw some money at art, and you've got this classical tradition that's beautifully painted paintings such as this one by Alexander Cabanel of The Birth of Venus, plus get a scene that is socially appropriate but very, very erotic, why wouldn't you go for that? Now, again, women artists don't represent the scene, or certainly not that much, and so, for obvious reasons, but also, here's a work, by the way, by Honoré Daumier, a political cartoon of women going through the salon. You know, why aren't women painting these? Well, what women would want to paint an image of a objectified female nude? And even further, what man would want a picture done by a woman of an objectified female nude when, frankly, she wouldn't have been given the same training, and it's probably not going to be that same glossy, airbrushed greatness of Cabanel. But what we see here are two women who are actually in the salon surrounded, you can tell, by those kind of nudes, which were everywhere to be seen. And remember, the Salon are these huge exhibitions to the art held in the Louvre every couple of years. And down beneath the caption says, "This year, again, Venuses, always Venuses." Like there are really women built like that. So then, you know what shifts to allow more women in the arts? Well, frankly, alternatives to the French Royal Academy and later to the British Royal Academy. Alternatives that open up both what subjects are deemed appropriate and venerated in art, as well as training that is open to women artists. So this is Berthe Morisot. Berthe Morisot came from an upper middle class family. She will find herself amidst other artists when she falls in love with Eugene Manet, who is Edouard Manet's brother, who she'll eventually marry. She does artistic training, and of course the thing that supports her move into the arts is the rise of Impressionism. Now, Impressionism, for those of you who don't know, was a series of exhibitions more than anything else that took place between 1874 and 1886 in an alternative space to the Royal Academy of the Arts. So it's a place that artists who weren't following those hard and fast classical rules of the Academy could go show their work and have their work bought. It didn't have to follow those rules, so you could pick different subjects and so forth. And so Berthe Morisot was one of these, and of course Mary Cassatt, who we'll get to in a minute, is another who had a great successful career. This is Manet's portrait, by the way, of Berthe Morisot. And then these scenes that Berthe Morisot did. This is the harbor at Lorient from 1869, so well before Impressionism even starts as exhibitions. Again, a genre scene of a harbor, a woman off to the right, a subject that, had it been shown in the Royal Academy, would have been placed very, very down low as a genre scene or a seascape, painted in this very kind of loose brushstroke. A scene here called On the Balcony from 1872. The scenes that you'll be seeing, both of Berthe Morisot and of Mary Cassatt, by the way, really emphasize women and have, as many art historians and critics have pointed out, a real insight into the life of women that it's not even clear that someone like Berthe Morisot was really trying to highlight. It's just the spaces of her own experience. So when you see a woman at a balcony looking off the balcony and you can't see what she's looking at, it feels, in this case, almost like she's hemmed in. That's a curious phenomena to feel. Balconies were one of the few places, because they are private, they're part of private estates or private houses, that women could be seen in public, kind of on display. They weren't allowed, by the way, in the 19th century, or at least not without getting a lot of unwanted attention, to wander the streets, for instance, of a town without a chaperone, which usually meant an older woman or an older man. You also get a lot of scenes, again, that men had never focused on, or when they had, they really weren't very good at. So this one, called The Cradle, is a scene of a young mother staring with obvious adoration at her young child. Before this, yes, you get a lot of emphasis on women as mothers, but more often than not, it's like the Virgin Mary as a mother, and some of you probably, if you can recall some of those depictions, know that the Virgin Mary, for the most part, doesn't really have a very intimate relationship with Christ as far as, the history of its representation, and there's not a lot of reality to that. Now, Impressionism in general, of course, was a focus on the everyday life of the middle classes of the time, and an interest in new painterly techniques that were trying to capture the way that something looked at that particular moment of time in a particular light. And so, it was oftentimes beaten up by academics as too sketchy, not finished enough, not accomplished or skilled enough. But of course, that's not what they are up to anyway. There's another scene, the dining room. So a woman in her interior, just giving you a sense of what she looked like. And as her career progressed, her brush stroke kept getting looser and looser, having this greater kind of sketchy quality to it, as you see here. This is Eugene Manet and his daughter in the garden. Again, an intimate scene of family life rendered in this great impressionist brush. And then finally, just a couple of scenes of something that have got her a lot of attention and lead to a lot of kind of different interpretations of her work. This is, what's usually referred to as the bath, a young woman at a kind of after or on her way to getting ready to go out. One thinks kind of at an adolescent stage, who is just maybe starting to get some sense of the attention that she'll get for her physical qualities, her beauty, her body, the attention she'll get from men, which is something again that she shows fairly frequently. So getting out of bed here, young woman, adolescent, a mother or a woman observing another woman reach that time in her life where she starts to become aware of people, of her own body, of other people, thinking of her as a sexual being perhaps, and so forth. Think of how these line up to Edgar Degas' works that are on some of the same subjects of women not appearing to know that they're being looked at, bathing themselves. The most popular artist of Impressionism, at least in terms of the number of works exhibited in Impressionist exhibitions as well as sold, would be Mary Cassatt. And this is a photo of her in her older years. Mary Cassatt came from an upper middle class family in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia particularly. She first attended the Pennsylvania Academy to the Arts and then realized it was one of the few venues in the United States that artists could be trained in. She realized pretty quickly that, in order to really, really progress as an artist, she was going to have to go to Europe. And because her family had connections in Paris, she decided to go to Paris rather than London, which is where, by the way, most American artists went. They would go to English-speaking London. But she ended up in Paris at the same time as the Impressionist exhibitions. She made close friends with Degas, which is still the world's biggest kind of million-dollar question. We know that Edgar Degas was a bit of a pain in the ass socially, and a lot of people didn't like him. He was tough to get along with, but they had a kind of lifelong friendship and really seemed to understand each other. Her subjects hover in between this interest in middle-class life, women's life at the time, and playing with new modernist ideas around brushstroke and capturing light and capturing the effect of shifting, changing light, being influenced, as so many of these artists were, by Japanese woodblock prints in particular, with their bold patterning and so forth. So I started us off here with Susan on the balcony. One of her friends, once again on a balcony, one of the few places women could be observed outside, kind of looking at the world, but once again, you don't see what she sees. All you see is her, which, again, whether it's true or not, a lot of interpretants, critics have pointed out, is giving you a sense of a woman's life really being constrained and contained, and these kind of compressed spaces that they experienced in their own lives. Some of her most famous scenes are scenes from the opera. Along with balconies, another place you could go in public and get some attention and see other people, be social, was the opera. By the way, people went to the opera, I presume, in part to see the opera, but more often than not, if you look at people's diaries from the time, all they talk about is who is going to be at the opera and what they're going to wear. They're not really talking about what the opera is all about. So one gets the sense that they were even more than a cultural event, a social event. So this one's called Woman in Black at the Opera. We see this woman with her opera glasses trained not down on the stage, but across the way. She's in a loge or an opera box. And while she is looking at someone else, in other words, seeing someone, you see off here on the side, a man is checking her out as well, right? You get up close on this, and like all Impressionist works, all of this dappling you see there is actually the canvas. It's a very sketchy quality, a few economical brushstrokes that are able to be read as a human face or opera glasses, and even more so, the man off on the side. Get up close on him, and he really just kind of looks like a squiggle, doesn't he? Now, had we been face to face, I would have spent a lot of time on this, getting you to tease out some of the differences between these two representations of women at the opera. The one on the left is usually just called Young Women at the Opera, or the Loge. The one on the right is sometimes referred to as Lydia in a loge wearing a pearl necklace. Lydia, as with all the names of the figures in these, are women in Mary Cassatt's life. Lydia is actually her sister, who was slowly dying of, I believe it was tuberculosis, but had a night out on the town where a family friend lent her a pearl necklace and she just felt great. So that's why we think this is at least based upon that experience. But since we're not face to face, I kind of have to do this my own. So I will point out some things that are important. One might say that the work on the left is the way that young women should be comporting themselves at the opera. They're fairly demure, they're fairly contained and restrained. One holds the very kind of Japanese-inspired design fan up in front of her face. They are pushed away from the picture plane. And importantly, and this is where I'm going, all of the colors that are in the bodies of the women are accented in cool tones, in blues and purples and so forth. Artists of this time are reading a lot of color theory, and the theory of color at the time that was really catching on is that cool colors felt like they were receding from the viewer, which, by the way, based upon the light, the wavelength of and frequency of cool colors seems to be the case. Whereas warm colors, things are on the spectrum of reds and yellows and so forth, feel like they're advancing. And so they started to play with this in their art. When they made changes to the way things actually looked, they might change things based upon the effects that a color would have. So if you wanted to represent two young women kind of almost aloof or acting demurely and holding themselves away from the public, why not put some cool tones in with the whites that make up their clothing? Whereas over here with Lydia, what you notice is that the majority of the colors in her body, in her dress, are warm tones, which makes her kind of radiate outwards. Notice how she's leaning into what we call the picture plane, that imaginary barrier between you and the scene of the painting itself. And of course, smiling glowingly at us. Someone who is kind of breaking some social norms, so to speak. And again, picture after picture, this is her working her hand at pastels. It's Lydia leaning on her arms. Miss Mary Ellison, seated with a fan. Once again, she not only did these scenes in the middle class, but also did a few portraits in her life. This is one of my, Miss Mary Ellison again, favorites. Really beautiful picture. And those things that I think are probably the reason she had such an impact on the art world, both in her own time and since. You know, a work like this called Mother and Child, and there are many of these mother and child works, not only captures something that hadn't been seen before, like a realistic looking child. I mean, look at children that are represented by Renaissance artists or classical artists. Their proportions are all wrong. They look horribly wrong. But here's a woman who, from her own experience, is able to draw and paint scenes of one of the most important relationships anyone will ever experience, which is between the mother and the child. Something that hadn't really been painted accurately before, hadn't been deemed a high enough subject in art, and something that she's seen so frequently in her life that she's able to nail it. I mean, here's this beautiful child, a young mother, wrapped up, in a tangle of limbs, looking out of her eye at this child, both kind of adoringly, but also exhausted. Notice the coffee over here. If this was a contemporary work, it'd say Starbucks on the side or something like that. Or another one, right? Mother and child scene. These, like so many Impressionist works and Modernist works in general, the artist will pick figures in their own lives, ask them to sit for them so that they can render this subject, which is on the one hand both specific to the person in their lives, but also larger than that, the relationship, in this case, between a mother and their child. And I just wanted to show you, she has a lot of different approaches to painting. You've been looking at the ones that are most common, these very kind of loose brushstroke Impressionist works, but this one's called Under the Chestnut Tree, which is obviously very, very strongly inspired by Japanese woodblock prints with these bold areas of washes of color. It's not an oil painting, it's what's known as a gouache, which is a a little bit more opaque version of a watercolor. The other thing that you get a lot of in Mary Cassatt's work and Impressionist works, because they're focusing on female experience, are what it was like to be a young woman, what was deemed appropriate. Lots of scenes of women reading, but if you look carefully at what they're reading, the types of books they're reading are kind of contemporary pulp fiction. Not reading, for instance, Karl Marx or something like that. Or in this case, the size of the book makes everyone believe that this is a picture book, right? Beautiful, beautiful scenes, but it gives you some insight on how women were trained to limit the possibilities of what they would be exposed to based upon societal norms. Except in every rare instance, for instance, her representation of her mom reading Le Figaro, you get, some glimpse of women who are breaking those social norms. Le Figaro, which is still around today, is a little bit like the New York Times or something. It's a big, very, very, international and political business world type of publication, something that, believe it or not, women were not supposed to bother with because, this wasn't really their realm and they couldn't possibly understand these things. Or scenes of women learning the basics of how to be a good, wife and mother, sewing, macrameing, crocheting, one scene after another of these. Because that's what they did. That's what they were taught. That's what she was exposed to, and that's what she represented. They're really great, aren't they? I wish we could go see them in person. A couple more artists just to round out today who are members of Expressionism. I wanted to start with Paula Modersohn Becker, who died rather young, or you probably hear more of her. She actually died from complications in childbirth, which is just kind of heartbreaking since you'll see in her work, a lot of her work was just about how important being a mother would be to her. This is her self-portrait with an amber necklace from 1907. She was trained in a little artistic community known as Worpswede, a little bit kind of like the German version of the Barbizon School, a community out in nature that really leaned into a new kind of fashionable idea of the time, which was usually known as the spirit of the folk. The folk are common people, returned to nature and primitivism, things that in France were being embraced by, for instance, Gauguin, who she traveled to Paris to study, for instance, were also being adopted in Germany at the time. This is during the time of the rise, kind of the early rise of Expressionism, of modern artists in Germany exaggerating or distorting or changing the way something looked so that the formal elements of the art itself, its color, its line, its shape, and so forth, could communicate something on their own terms. So for instance, here in the self-portrait wearing an amber necklace, the simplification of the form, that really kind of simplified form, is meant to communicate to you the simple life, the life of the folk, the life of the primitive, the life of someone who's not caught up in material goods. Even the amber necklace, amber is kind of one of the earliest jewel forms, is meant to refer to that. And this is based upon, I should just say, and a lot of artists would use photography as such, photography as an aid of memory. And you see in her representations of motherhood, for instance here, Mother and Child from 1903, that kind of very, very simplified form, painting that looks like it's done by someone who's never been artistically trained. It's very common for artists who have had years and years of training to affect that kind of look to their art, because they believe that that look of simplified form really matches with the subject of a simplified world, of a person who's just caught up with nature, their child, the basics of life, rather than materialism. Remember, Gauguin's out there a little bit before this time, returning to the primitive life, supposedly, in the Marquesas Islands, as you see it here. Basically a Western tourist, seeking to surround himself with sexually available young women, as far as I can tell. But, that's something that is a totally different story. This is a Kneeling Mother and Child from 1907. One of the things that a lot of critics have pointed out is that you get a woman in here representing female nudity, and it's all about kind of the maternal nude, the woman as simplified into a kind of primitive mother, a life-giving force, rather than a figure who is there for the voyeuristic appeal that nude body can have to a heterosexual male. This is her famous self-portrait on her 6th wedding day from 1906, where she's already imagining herself pregnant. It's the last of her major work. She will take some time off to give birth to her child, which unfortunately is the end of her, so to speak. And just think of the difference between this. And if you think a little bit about, Raphael's Madonna and Child scenes and what that child looks like and what Madonna looks like versus this scene over here, and then you add to it, what would the history of classical representations of maternity look like if there were more women artists out there who could draw from their own experience or the experience of the people around them that they were intimately acquainted with? It leads to a lot of, it's a very interesting question to me anyway. So the last artist for today, and it's one that we could spend weeks on, is Käthe Kollwitz. Käthe Kollwitz's main artistry is etchings and engravings, so printmaking processes, which allows you to create multiples of a particular image. She used this, as far as I can tell, having looked into this very thoroughly, mainly because this was a type of art form that was widely distributable. You can, create print multiples of these, and you can get them into newspapers, into periodicals. You can publish fairly inexpensive prints of this. You can sell them to more people. You can get the word out in a way that a painting just is either shown in a gallery and everyone has to come to it, or one person owns it. And because her art is so fundamentally based upon changing the world, it only makes sense. Now, Käthe Kollwitz was trained academically. She married a young surgeon in Berlin who administered to the working poor, where she actually worked as a triage nurse. Her politics were very left-leaning. She was constantly on the side of the working person, particularly the plight of working women. And so if you remember my one-off lecture, I brought this one in, part of the Weavers series, a series of multiple prints on this subject, and this is called Poverty, where you see a child who one presumes is either sleeping or maybe even sick. The weaver herself, surrounded by her looms and such, who is really, really distraught, the whole picture being quite dark and feeling very bleak, with a mother kind of looking on that one presumes is helping out her daughter in this very difficult situation. It certainly has a different quality to it, doesn't it, than the Seamstress by Blunden. Like, one seems real and the other seems like, I don't know, the kind of USA television network special on the plight of women seamstresses. Or this one, the riot. So women kind of, and men throwing up their hands and saying, that's it, we're not going to put up with this. This is all happening, by the way, at the time that a lot of the kind of early moments of workers' unionization, or at least organization, is starting to come together. And she's basically creating work like this, like saying on the one hand, hey, be aware these things are happening in weaving, where people are revolting against their ill treatment, and everyone else can do this, and also exalting people to go do this, or exhorting them to do it. In fact, in her most famous series, the Peasant War series, she does just this, but with a kind of slyness to it. The Peasant Revolt series is actually supposedly based upon the peasant revolts of the 16th century. In other words, it's couched as something that she's representing as a part of history, where in the 16th century, during the Protestant Reformation, a lot of the lower class people revolted against their treatment and the hierarchies in society that kept them down. And she's representing that, but she's representing it with a mind to saying to her contemporary public, you're not all that much better off. We need to have revolts today. Now, since she couches it historically, she can't get in as much trouble, I guess I should say, politically. People can't go after her because she can always say, oh, I was just representing this thing that happened. But everyone knew what was up. So here we have a scene from the Peasant Revolts where a woman, in this case, a woman that was well known in the Peasant Revolts of the 16th century, known as Black Anna, is exhorting the masses of poverty masses, all holding various kind of makeshift weapons that are based upon farm implements, to go off and fight against their ill treatment. This is a scene that is so that one's called The Outbreak. This one is called Rape, believe it or not. It's a scene of, again, from the Peasant Revolts, that is about the treatment of the lower classes, raped and murdered and left in fields to die. And of course, sexual assault was certainly part of her own world, and she can't talk about it directly, so she talks about it historically. Or in this case, after the battle, so some of those scenes, and we see a mother out kind of checking to see if she can find her fallen son, which is the subject of some of her most powerful art. Now, Expressionism changes the way that things would really look. Let's say if you took a photograph of it, distorts it, exaggerates it, changes it in one way or another to make you feel what the subject is. So in this case, a work that is called Mother with Dead Child from 1903, you see a woman who has lost her child, something that she had witnessed in her practice with her husband, something that unfortunately she's going to witness in her own life. Her son Peter, who is actually the model for this work, will die very early on in World War I. So what happens? I mean, this is everyone's worst nightmare. The mother with a dead child in their arms, and you can see this kind of almost animal-like pain that the face shows. The mother almost trying to, it looks like, absorb the child back into herself. The very prominent lines that are all around the woman's body, giving you a sense of a body kind of shaking in all of this emotionality. What I always say with Expressionism is it's the acknowledgement on the one hand that some subjects are too big or too painful or too overwhelming or even too subtle to really get at in a very straightforward representational way. And just like poetry, you can exaggerate or change or really use the formal elements of an art form in order to evoke or express those huge or subtle emotions. And you just reverse the story, and you've got, woman, child, and death, where the woman is dying and the child is latching on to her. Death is represented both symbolically as a skeletal form, but also very, painfully as this kind of black void of nothingness into which the woman is being drawn, while that child tries to hold her back, and she, of course, is trying to hold herself back. Look at this incredible quadricep muscle straining against this. Also wanted to point out that in her subjects there are a number of scenes of sex and lovemaking, and as a woman, and a very emancipated woman, unlike, let's say, Edvard Munch's work over here of a woman as a evil seductress who is just going to be a kind of femme fatale and suck the vital energy out of you. This is called the vampire over here on the left. In her representations of lovemaking, you see two equal partners in it. You know, not one or the other's desire or, you know, predilections being given more prominence. And just to let you know, we always focus on some of the kind of higher art forms when we look at artists, but a lot of these artists, you know, that are of the modern era, including Käthe Kollwitz, will produce works that are just simple posters meant to be put up all over town, like this one that says "Never Again War," which she produced after World War I. So I'm going to pause there for today, and hopefully I'll see you next week face to face, and we'll continue on by moving to the United States and seeing what's going on there, and starting with Georgia O'Keeffe.